Gentlemen, thanks so much for being with us. Iain, can I start with you? David Van Raybroek reckons elections are hurting democracy, and you agree with him. So what's the problem with elections here in Australia?
Fundamentally, they're not helping us reach trusted public decisions. They have a little bit become beauty contests, where David would perhaps throw all elections out. We aim to be a little bit more, there's a complementary role for everyday people. And it's just about making those incremental steps that can restore trust so we can make trusted public decisions. Elections on their own are not enough.
So what is it about the last election campaign, for instance, where you saw it was broken?
I don't think it was just us. I think after 7 weeks of that, most people would have preferred to go to the dentist than have another week of that election campaign. And that's because they're not really an opportunity to explore issues in depth. They're a chance to win the news. Fundamentally with voting, we vote for the people we hate least. So hence we see advertising campaigns that emphasise the negative. It's not because political parties and the people who lead them are bad people. It's because that's really effective.
Sammy Shah, can I bring you in here? Because you have the distinction of witnessing elections both here and in Pakistan. What regard are they held in both countries?
When Pakistan, whenever they happen, it's such a a moment of joy because it's a rare opportunity. We don't get them very often, and whenever we do, we can hold on to them for as long as we can. In Australia, I find that the elections, there's this fatigue towards elections where people are like, oh, the elections are coming up and I'm so sick of it and I'm so tired of it. But I think the difference is they're tired of the lead up to the election. Like was said right now, is the 7 weeks leading up to the election that people get sick of and everything. The election itself, that one day, that's a lot easier. I think you can actually have more of those and get rid of the campaigning and all of that. If we just have an election every day and choose a new prime minister every day, then everyone gets to be a part of the system, everyone gets to contribute, and also there's no campaigning because there's no time for that anymore.
Well, Simon Jackman, we have gone through a lot of prime ministers, so it's almost like we're having an election every day. But you support the process of elections being good for democracy, don't you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, what's the alternative? I mean, there are a few models on the table, but it's almost difficult to conceive of democracy without elections. The closest we've got is perhaps the Athenian model, where we might have a random jury pool pulled together. But they're not without their problems either. You know, what issues will they decide? Who decides that sort of what will the juries be about problem still has to be solved. And so I'm sort of reminded of Winston Churchill here, when he was talking about democracy compared to other forms of government. You know, it's bad compared to all other forms. So it's not quite clear.
So elections are the worst thing for democracy, except for all the others.
Well, and there are elections and there are elections. I think it's important to be clear about the vast variety of institutional designs we have available. For instance, we've got compulsory voting with preferential voting in Australia. We've got the American system with the Electoral College for the presidency. In Australia, we've got a different system again for the upper house and the Senate. I think we've got to take all that into account and figure out, are we upset about that or are we upset about the campaigns? And let's get our story straight here.
Well, let's pull back a little bit. If you don't think there's a problem with elections, do you see any sort of disillusionment setting in Western democracies with politics?
Yeah, well, I think we want to be careful that, we want to distinguish disillusionment with politics and elections per se from what the output of that process has been. I think it's important, some people get into their heads the idea that it doesn't make a difference who you vote for and therefore the electoral process itself is irrelevant. I think it's important to remember in the United States, who becomes the president of the United States actually is quite consequential. You look over since World War II to the present, Democratic presidents are in fact good for the working and middle classes. Turns out that Republican presidents aren't so good for the working and middle classes. The rich do well under both scenarios, and we might say that's a problem. But for most people in the United States, the party that controls the presidency, that's consequential. It really does matter. And as much as we may say we're fatigued with the process, at the end of the day, it's important to remember it really does make a difference.
I guess what we're seeing and what David Van Raybroek is saying is that we're seeing less engagement in those countries where voting's not compulsory. You know, we're lowering party membership figures. Is there a problem with politics that's driving the things that he's talking about?
It's not a problem with politics, it's a problem with the system itself. Simon, I listened to your Winston Churchill quote, and it was a little bit selective because if you actually look it up, if you're sitting at home on your smartphone, you'd look it up and he said, except for all the others that have been tried. And that have been tried is a pretty critical point. And all we're saying is, well, let's try some new things as well. The point that David Van Raybroek makes in his book is simply that elections came along a little late in the scene, and he delivers this wonderful explanation of an election campaign that's riven with personal contest. All the business of the nation stops. It's a little bit he said, she said, like a bad marriage. And he gets to the end and said, this will hold back America. And it's interesting because that wasn't a quote from our modern era with parties, our modern era with social media. It was actually taken from 1793. It's not about the modern era and change. We have a structural problem that any time we have an election, we kind of have a beauty contest because I'm 1/16 millionth of a vote. How much attention do you really pay? We're treating it a little bit too much like a football team. And that's not about the politicians. It's about the need for a complementary mechanism that gets beyond elections.
Sammy, now you're now a broadcaster or you're a member of the media. Do you think that the media cycle, the 24-hour news cycle, opinion poll-based journalism is forcing a change in politics for the good or the better or the bad?
Well, I think that's a change that's inevitable. That's not something that can be rolled back in any way. The change happened when Richard Nixon had to put face makeup on for the first time on television, and it all changed. And I think that's an important thing. America has set itself up as the role model for democracy in the entire world. It's always set itself up as a golden standard, and everyone should sort of aspire to be America. It's what America uses as a justification when it rolls into another country, is that we're spreading democracy. And democracy, American democracy, has had a huge PR hit. I mean, what's happening right now over there, you can look at many countries who are looking at that and saying, I think I'm good with the dictatorship. I think the alternative, not so bad. And look, I've lived under dictatorships. I think they get a bad rap sometimes. I think the important thing you have to remember is that democracy requires participation. It requires you to be actively involved. No one has the time. I got to do the groceries. I got to pick up my kid. I have to watch a whole new season of Luke Cage on Netflix. I can't also worry about what politicians are doing. If there's a dictator, he can be in charge. He can rule the country. I don't have a say in it. I never got to choose him. It's not my fault if he does something bad. I can free up my time to do other things like write a poem about how great the dictator is or build a statue to honor the dictator. I mean, I'm just saying we haven't tried everything.
So Sammy's voting for a North Korea-style approach here, Simon. What do you think is the answer then? If we're seeing disillusionment increase in politics, Iain and Van Braybroek are saying the elections are the problem. Well, how would you propose to improve things?
I think the digital age that we're living in actually offers perhaps the opportunity for democracy's greatest moment, perhaps, that we may be yet to enter a golden age of democracy. We have the ability for rapid voting on lots of things. We may be able to have yet more elections about more things. We won't have them every 3 years. We can do balloting that might even be substantive, maybe even deliberative. On really short time frames. We won't be waiting necessarily.
Yes, Sammy, do you want to say something?
Is the word that you're trying to not say plebiscite? Because you've said ballot, you've said online polling. There's a lot of non-plebiscite-y words there.
There's a whole other Friday night debate in that topic. Iain, I know you're desperate to jump in here.
My blood just ran cold. That's the end of times as we know it. If you think the problem is politicians, then what you describe is a fabulous thing where everyone gets to vote on everything. I actually think the problem is one of public opinion. And our system is excessively responsive to public opinion. What did people think in the next 10 seconds? And the whole system responds to it because they're chasing a vote. I want to see what happens if not what people think in the next 2 minutes, and they will not think in that environment. Yeah, click to vote, online voting is a disaster. That's not the system of response we want. I'm going to ask our guests here, and anyone watching, I've got 350 people in South Australia looking at a question of whether the South Australia should consider taking international high-level nuclear waste. That is something I would argue is beyond our normal cycle of elections. It's something commissioned by Premier Weatherall in South Australia. We're not asking people what they think tomorrow. We're letting them immerse themselves in a topic and see if they can find common ground. For me, that's an acid test of whether we can find trust in public decisions. And if people like the look of it, we will front $5 million to do this in Canberra on how we restore trust to democracy. We will design it, we will operate it, we will fund it.
I guess
so
what Iain and
you're saying that people who, let's not forget, people as a whole, when you take humanity as a whole, we're not smart. We got swept away by Gangnam Style, and you're saying that we should now be trusted with nuclear waste on an online poll?
No, not an online poll. Exactly, not an online poll.
Okay.
And it's a tough task trying to have a discussion with a comedian because you're always going to lose. But ultimately, no, it's a case of I don't want to do it in an online poll. I don't care what people think in the next 5 minutes. But after 60 hours, I actually think people are smart enough. And we test this again and again. People have the capability if you show them that it's worth their time.
So what you're saying is a jury system. People can understand that concept. You're arguing you get 12, 50, 100 people, sit them down, let them hear the arguments of both sides, make the call. Simon Jackman, do you think the jury system, which is the Athenian system you were talking about earlier, is there merit in that?
There is merit in it. It's hard to administer. Some of the studies I've seen, one of my colleagues at Stanford was gung-ho on this, Jim Fishkin. He's done them in Australia before. What we tended to see, looking carefully, strong personalities dominate, just as they do in juries. At 350 people, those dynamics may get mediated out a little bit. You've got this meta question, though, sitting over the top of them. Who decides that the nuclear waste question is the one that gets put to the jury? Why that one and not 18,000 other questions in public policy? And having a parliament that has the ability to take on the issues subject to the Constitution, well, that's the model we've got now, and they're responsible to us at the end.
Yeah, Sammy, I guess we've seen this kind of thing tried before. Kevin Rudd called it the 2020 summit. How did that go? Have you heard anything that's come from that?
Well, I haven't heard anything in terms of tangibly useful that's come from that. I do think at the end of it, look, if you give people information, if you actually trust the public with informed choices, which means you give them all the relevant information, that is a lot of responsibility and people might be able to manage it well. But it is also, it might just be something we're asking too much of everyone for, because if I have to research a topic, how do I even know the information I'm being provided with is unbiased at this point? There's an information glut. Even a topic like nuclear waste, I mean, there's different people who are involved, who have their own biases, who have their own vested interests. I will never get information that I can categorically say is truly unbiased and clean, and therefore any opinion I make will always be influenced by people outside of my world, which is not fair to a lot of people who are asked to make this, which is why we elect politicians in the first place, get the information, make the decisions. And the lack of trust shown in politicians right now, which is uniformly across the board, means that they're not getting information from sources that the audience or the public really can rely on.
Now, we're just almost out of time, but Iain, I want to give you the last word because you're the one trying to make the argument here. You've heard Sammy's argument about trust in the information, and that's what we hire the politicians for. Simon is saying, well, who decides the question? That's the real power. How would you respond to them?
Sure. In terms of who sets the question, we always see this as a complementary model, an elected house of people complemented by a randomly selected group of people. If your government of the day, whichever side it may be, says this is the topic we discuss, absolutely give that agenda-setting power to an elected house. But if a government of either side passed something to a random group of 100 people and 90% of them looked at it in detail across 6-8 weeks and said, actually, this is fair enough, I think that does improve public trust. And I do trust everyday people because with no factions, no donors, no media profile, there's no reason not to trust them. They just come up, they live here, they want to make the right decision. If nothing else, with where we are now, it's worth trying.
All right. Well, Sammy Shah, Simon Jackman and Iain Walker, thank you so much for being on Lateline.
Thank you.
Thank you.